Hello, everybody. A warm welcome to you. Sounds like we have people from all over Canada today, in the sunshine and in the rain and in the cold. So we just really appreciate you taking time out of your busy working day to be with us this morning, and we are very excited about this session. So a warm welcome to you. Um, you, I think, know our team: Jordan Clark, our technology support. Matthew Lang, who's here by my side. Just wonderful to have him and his great skills and techniques. We would be lost without him. And then, of course, I want to say grandfather, but I mean that very respectfully, John Higginbottom, who really dreamed up this idea of having an advanced practice. So we're very grateful to John on the left and myself, Regina. So thanks again for being with us this morning. You'll know that advanced practice is funded by the British Columbia Ministry of Health and intended to provide leadership, education and guidance to the mental health field, and really to help put effective evidence-based psychosocial rehabilitation practices into place. And today, I think you'll agree that this is certainly talking about evidence-based practice and our way forward as a Canadian mental health system. We want to say a big thanks to our instructors for their support and expertise. You'll know that they provide us this service and they're really not paid for it. So without their generosity, we wouldn't be here with you today. And you will know that we have 21 high quality webinars on our website. So please, if you haven't before, please have a little peruse around there, and I hope that you will find something relevant to your practice. So with advanced practice, our purpose is to support clinicians and managers who provide psychosocial rehabilitation services and recovery-oriented services by transferring the evidence-based knowledge, by providing expert consultation. So of late, Dr. Higginbottom and I spent some time with Ireland Health Authority. We had the great privilege of spending 3 days within their health system and hopefully provided some helpful feedback about recovery-oriented psychosocial rehabilitation practices and their programs. So that's that part of that consultation we're growing. We hope to provide training and education events, so you'll know about our 21 webinars, and also we have upcoming 6 sessions on employment, so stay tuned. So starting in January, we will have some returning guests, for example, Chris Arnold. We will have a session on small businesses with Dr. Krupra and Dr. Rosemary Lysab. We will have a session hopefully on youth, and we're working on having a session looking at law and employment services. So stay tuned for that. We're pretty excited about this work as well. So you'll know that our website, on that website that we have, the psyrehab.ca website, there are resources of the webinars, and also we have multiple documents supporting those webinars. So different forms, assessments, all kinds of good resources on there. So hopefully that's helpful to you. And then the last part of our work is supporting the Provincial Advisory Committee and the community of PSR practice in general. So we hope that you're helpful. And to that end, we really need to hear from you. So you'll know at the end of every session, we ask for your feedback. And quite honestly, we really take that feedback very seriously. And we're planning to maybe just give you a little bit of a snippet of that feedback. So with the BC Ministry of Health, we recently sent them a document about 2 weeks ago, just outlining our accomplishments and our work over since we started. So we'll just send people who are on our list just a very brief overview of that. So we thank you for taking the time to give us feedback because we're really learning and growing as a result. So we need it. We thank you. It is my great pleasure to present to you our 2 presenters today. So our first person, many of you may have met. Bonita's been to British Columbia a couple of times for sure. And Bonita is a knowledge broker with the Mental Health Commission of Canada, where she works to bridge that gap between knowledge, evidence, and experience and practice. So I think those goals are very much in line with our advanced practice. Bonita's focus is primarily on topics related to recovery-oriented practice, diversity, and caregivers. Since joining the Mental Health Commission of Canada in 2014, she has worked as part of a recovery initiative developing, consulting on, promoting, disseminating the guidelines for recovery-oriented practice, which is really the topic of our conversation today. And then we have dear Aimee LeBlanc, who has spent over a decade working in mental health and addictions, including with the Ontario Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, developing strategic and programmatic provincial mental health policies. Since joining the Mental Health Commission of Canada, Amy's worked on at-home chez soi project, supporting its implementation and dissemination. Her current work continues to focus on issues of housing and homelessness, as well as supporting other such areas as implementation of the guidelines for recovery-oriented practice and suicide prevention. So I think you'll agree we have some very, very well qualified people to come and talk to us today about recovery-oriented guidelines. And I know this community is very excited to hear what they have to say and what they have to say about the link between recovery and psychosocial rehabilitation. So with no more further ado, I hand you over to
Well, good morning, everybody. This is Bonita calling in from Ottawa. I'm here with Aimee. We want to thank you first, Regina and Matthew, so much for giving us the opportunity to present on the guidelines. And we want to thank everybody who is, I guess, logged into the webinar today, who's interested in learning about this. We're really thrilled to get to be able to share this with each and every one of you. So as Regina mentioned, I'm a knowledge broker. I work in our Knowledge Exchange Center. Aimee is our Senior Policy Analyst on our Prevention and Promotion team. She's also a Master's of Social Work, so she is a practitioner like many of you. So I guess to get a bit of housekeeping out of the way, throughout the webinar, we hope that you feel free to type in your questions into the chat. We'll do our very best to capture them and get to them sort of at the appropriate times. So we've chunked the webinar out into a couple of sections, and we'll try and address them at the end of each of our sections. And I guess I can see from the chat we've got people from all over the country. We've got Manitoba, Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario. So thank you all for signing in. I'm going to assume that most of you are PSR practitioners already, but if not, please add to the chat. Let us know what you're doing, what your areas of expertise are. We'd love to know. And so here's our first poll. So we're curious to know who we have with us today. So are you a practitioner, a clinician, an administrator, a family member, a person with lived experience, student? Please go in, add to the poll. We'd love to see who we're speaking to today. So while people are filling that out, I'm going to talk a little bit about our learning objectives. We're here to talk about the guidelines for recovery-oriented practice and how they can be used and integrated into clinical practice. So we figured we'd start with a brief overview of the concept of recovery as seen through the work of the Mental Health Commission. Then we'll move into an overview of the guidelines documents, so its key components, the competencies, values, attitudes, knowledge, skills, and behaviors, with a focus on the first chapter of the document, which is all about creating a culture and language of hope. Then we'll do a bit of a crosswalk with all of you because we imagine a lot of you are PSR practitioners. So we want to talk a little bit about how the guidelines principles and the PSR principles align. And then we also want to look at how the competencies talked about in the guidelines are, I guess, in line and how they can be used to support the PSR competencies that were released in, I believe, 2013. So finally, at the end, if you guys stick with us that long, we're going to talk, we'd like to have a bit of a discussion using some of the reflective practice questions that are outlined in the document. So given that, I think we're going to sort of move on and jump into today's conversation.
And sorry to just quickly check in with you there, Bonita. I'm wondering, do you guys have availability to webcam?
Yes, we do. That's me, Bonita. Hi, everybody.
Hi, this is Aimee.
I think maybe you just got to hit share one more time. Perfect.
There we are.
Hi, this is Aimee.
And we hope all of you can see us. Now, Matthew, I'm having a hard time advancing our slides. Is that normal? There we go. So to follow up with the learning objectives that we had posted, so we're going to define recovery, we're going to identify core competencies, values, attitudes, knowledge, skills, behaviors. We're going to identify some of the similarities and some of the differences between the PSR work and the guidelines work. And then we're going to hopefully use a reflective practice questions to help enhance your practice and ours as well. So thanks so much for joining us. Out of the gate, I do want to acknowledge all of the awesome work that PSR Canada and PSR International has done on recovery. PSR providers have really long incorporated recovery ideas and practices into their work, and they've been huge advocates for its widespread adoption. It's been incorporated into leading and promising practices in key domains that you guys work in, like housing, employment, education, leisure, wellness, living skills. So in some instances, I know we may or may not be preaching to the converted here, but we still want to give this a go. And I think maybe one of the lenses we should all consider is how we all work together to actually advance recovery and how we use documents like the guidelines to do that together. So, recovery in the work of the Mental Health Commission of Canada. I'm big on introductions, so for those of you not familiar with the Mental Health Commission of Canada and who we are, I think it's important to sort of let you know where we came from. So in 2006, there was a standing Senate Committee on Social Affairs, Science, and Technology, and they released a report called Out of the Shadows at Last. That report was one of the first to sort of look at the mental health system as a whole in Canada. One of the recommendations out of that document was to create a national body like the Mental Health Commission, and thus we were born in 2007. So our original mandate was for 10 years to work from 2007 to 2017, and we were tasked with writing Canada's first mental health strategy, because at the time we were the only G8 country not to have one. We were looking at addressing stigma and discrimination and building a knowledge exchange capacity in Canada, which is the Knowledge Exchange Centre where I work out of. There was also an expanded mandate, and that was to work on the at-home Chez Soi project that Amy was working on, which was the largest housing and homelessness demonstration research project, I think, in the world. So there's lots of great information that came out of that if you're not familiar with it. Also, so you know, in April of this year, during the budget announcement, the Commission's mandate was renewed for an additional 10 years, so we're going to be around until 2027. We're not totally sure what our mandate is going to be for the next 10 years, but we are definitely going to be around continuing this work. So why are we talking about recovery? Out of the Shadows at Last and Toward Recovery and Well-Being, which was a framework that was created before the completion of the mental health strategy, both recognize the importance of recovery-oriented mental health services, as well as systems to improve the outcomes for people living with mental health problems and illnesses in Canada. So it's really been at the core of the work that the Mental Health Commission has been doing. Ultimately, our goal, I think, as the Mental Health Commission is to help shift policies and practices towards recovery and well-being and all of the efforts that we're doing. So this is really at our center. So for those of you not familiar with this strategy, it has 6 strategic directions. The second strategic direction is actually to foster recovery and well-being for people of all ages living with mental health problems and illnesses, and to uphold their rights. So it's right up front. We know that this is super important. Within that, 2 of the recommendations that I think are most important to the work we're going to talk about today are recommendation 2.11 and 2.12. And the first is about implementing a range of recovery-oriented initiatives in Canada, including the development and implementation of recovery guidelines. And that is really the basis for the work that we're going to talk about today. And the second is to promote the education and training of mental health professionals, and other service providers in recovery-oriented approaches. And I think in a lot of ways that has been the work of PSR Canada and a lot of the work that they've been doing. So kudos to them, and I think we're working together to keep this all going. So I'm going to pass it over to Amy now, who's going to talk a little bit more about recovery and what we're talking about as a concept of the Commission.
Thanks, Bonita. We thought it was important to spend, I'm trying to get myself lined up in the camera, to spend some time talking about exactly what recovery is and how it created the foundation of the guidelines and sort of the approach we took for it. I think that recovery is a term that means a lot of different things to different people and has a lot of nuance embedded in it. So as Bonita mentioned, we have the strategy for Canada, and that's where we drew our definition, our initial definition of what is recovery. And how we defined it is as living a satisfying, hopeful, and meaningful life, even when there may be ongoing limitations related to mental health issues. So from the Commission's standpoint, and certainly guiding the work that we were doing with the guidelines, there's a fundamental belief that recovery is about a person taking charge of their own mental health and well-being, about being able to set their own goals and define what it is they need, and as well as being able to access those needed services, supports, and treatments. It's also about walking alongside a person and offering support to people. It's not necessarily about people walking the recovery journey alone. So it refers to a process or journey of healing to which to the greatest extent possible, people are empowered to make informed choices about the services, treatments, and supports that they need to best meet their own needs. It also inherently acknowledges the role that practitioners play and the important role that practitioners play in recovery. And it also is about the importance of the mental health system in being available, accessible, and being recovery oriented, so that the mental health system itself is organized to support and sustain people throughout their recovery journey. It's important from our perspective, to acknowledge that recovery doesn't mean a cure. It's a process that's going to be marked both by setbacks and by achievements, and that every person's journey towards recovery is unique. But again, they don't journey alone, that each of us have a network of social contacts, friends, family members, spiritual and cultural contexts that are important to our own mental health and well-being. And I just want to point out the three words we have here: hope, dignity, and inclusion. And those were the tagline that we pulled out to reflect the guidelines, because we thought that hope, dignity, and inclusion really are the essence of what recovery is and what we hope that recovery embodies. So the figure that we see here, this nice colorful pie chart, is an attempt to outline the core concepts and principles of recovery. So the pieces of pie are an attempt to depict the range of concepts that are included in recovery. There may be some missing, or there may be some that people think should have been labeled differently, but from what we were hoping to do here is try and get a sense of the broad, holistic nature of what recovery is. So I think for me, given that the ultimate goal of recovery is for a person to embark on their own path towards recovery, really the concepts that stick out for me are ones around self-determination, the fact that that recovery and support should be focused on a person as an individual and what their own needs are. As well, the non-linear, a recognition of the fact that our journeys towards recovery are not necessarily going to go in a straight line, that all of us, when we're setting out to achieve goals, sometimes we move forward, sometimes we step back, sometimes we step completely sideways and go off in a different direction, but that's just a natural part of human nature. And then another piece for me is the strengths-based. I think it's, in some of the work that I've done, it's important recognizing that all of us have inherent strengths and skills that we bring to whatever the journey is that we're embarking upon. I also think that, given that seeing from your poll that many of you are clinicians, it's really important to acknowledge the pieces that are embedded beneath these concepts, that it's not necessarily just about offering empowerment or holistic care, that there's skills and there's sort of skills and work that go behind that to make those real. So, for example, the need to support people's choice. As professionals, breaking down power dynamics between ourselves and the people that we're working with, thinking through how it is that we support people's decision making, considering how we engage in goal setting with people, recognizing that people's goals are going to cross a wide range from education, health, treatment, and that sometimes what we may think is a priority may not necessarily be the priority of the person that that we're working with. So I think that there's a whole set of skills that support this: motivational interviewing, working from strengths-based approaches, being able to broker connections to a wide range of services are all key concrete steps that many of us as practitioners take when we're working from a recovery-oriented place. I'm going to give one example from my work when I was with At Home. Some of you who are from BC may be aware of Brain City, which is a great organization based out of Vancouver. And they've done a series of videos that are really interesting around housing first and those principles. And one of them is recovery. And in their recovery video, they interviewed one of their service providers. And she talked about what recovery was for her in her work. And so she talks about one of the clients she was working with who said that her goal, her recovery goal, was to have food in the cupboard at the end of the week. So to have food to eat at the end of every week. And so for this worker, she realized that created a whole set of other goals that you could work on. So it wasn't necessarily saying, well, you need to go in and get treatment or you need to get your physical health taken care of. But in fact, by saying, okay, so if our goal is to have food in the cupboard at the end of every week, then what is it that we need to do about buying more food? How do you do food management? How do you develop cooking skills? And what they found is that suddenly for this individual, she was spending more on food and less on her drugs, that her mental health and her health suddenly increased. So what came out as kind of one simple goal maybe wasn't as big as, enter treatment or embark on a big treatment program, suddenly became something that was significantly life-changing. The other piece I just want to quickly mention before I move on is the importance of recognizing that while recovery is focused on the individual, that a big part of recovery is the importance of taking a holistic approach and then seeing the person as a whole, so within their community and social setting. So recognizing the importance of the social determinants of health. So this is including sort of the notions of full citizenship and community and social integration, which is key, and allowing for communities and social circles to develop that support recovery. So again, I'll draw on one other example from At Home, where we had a person who was living in a market rental apartment who had formerly been homeless, and they had some concerns and questions about the apartment. And instead of the landlord feeling like this person's complaining and I'm going to evict them or I need to take remedial measures, the landlord actually thought, I want to include this individual, and they hired them to work at the building, to become almost like an ombudsperson, to connect with the other neighbors. And it was a lovely way for an individual to suddenly feel connected and a part of a community and where they lived. So I'll move on to the next slide, and this really embodies some of the concepts that I was just talking about, how that recovery is about an individual, but it's also about our community and social integration. So for the individual, it's recognizing their unique experience and goals and defining what it is important to them. And so as practitioners, it's the work that we do in building strong alliances, challenging power dynamics, and seeing people's strengths and possibilities. But it's also seeing that none of us journey alone and that our experiences are shaped by our individual, family, cultural, community experiences. And so recognizing the importance, the significant impact that factors such as poverty, housing, isolation, discrimination can have on individuals. And so seeing that people are going to need to be supported by a wide range of services, supports, and treatments. And so really the goal is ultimately to enable people to exercise all their rights as citizens and to enjoy a meaningful life in their community while striving to achieve their full potential. And then I think the challenge for practitioners is helping people to navigate that complex range of systems and services that a person may need or encounter. So the next few slides are going to get into a few of the principles behind recovery orientation. And again, these are pieces that we use to help drive the guidelines, sort of the foundations behind the guidelines. So for those of you who are PSR practitioners, I suspect this will map quite closely with the work that you've already been doing. But again, we just wanted to outline it for those that may not be as familiar. I also think it's easy. There's a risk when we talk about recovery and the recovery orientation, there's a risk that it becomes trendy or just becomes a concept that we use, but we don't necessarily drill into the principles and skills that are behind it. And again, I'll quickly say that in the next few principles, they're going to cover a number of the concepts we've already talked about in the previous slides. So the concept of individual, being hope, strengths focused. So we'll see that in the first principle here, which is recovery is person driven, and that recovery really starts with hope, optimism, and a fundamental belief that recovery is possible. There's no single pathway to recovery. It's uniquely a personal journey, self-determined and self-managed. And recovery is an ongoing journey marked by achievements and setbacks, and it enables people to take charge of their mental health and well-being. And then secondly, the second principle is that recovery is supported by building meaningful relationships and through social networks. And so this gets at that notion where recovery is enhanced by people's full participation in all aspects of their lives. That family, friends, peers are all important supporters and facilitators, and they strengthen people's journey towards recovery. And that's really important that we have supportive communities that are welcoming, address stigma and discrimination, and seek to ensure equitable access for people to housing, income, and resources. And also I want to acknowledge the key importance for the integration of peer support workers and the valuable role that they can play in a recovery-oriented system. So the next couple of principles, so one is around the practices and services that support the recovery journey and how that happens in many ways. So in a broad sense, recovery is about looking beyond illness and seeing the resilient strengths and capacities people have. But it's also about enabling people to find their own goals and master the tools that they need to take responsibility, and maximizing the opportunity to enable people to do that. So again, accessing appropriate services, treatments, and supports. And then the fourth principle, I think, is a really key one, and that's that supporting recovery requires leadership. That we all have responsibility, those of us working directly with clients to people in management, that all of us in the work that we do, our colleagues, the environment that we work in, it needs to allow for and support recovery-oriented work. And so this could be through training, education, supporting clinicians. So there's a range of ways that, that we can do that. I don't know if we want to pause here quickly for some questions before we kick into the next section more on the guidelines themselves.
Matthew, did you catch any questions that came up in that section?
Nothing that's come through the chat as yet, but folks, if they do have questions, now would be an awesome time. And the other sort of thing that we were wondering is, did you want to poll folks' reaction to the pie?
Yeah,
that would be great.
That would be great.
Just going to pull it up.
I'd be curious as well if there's pieces that people think is missing. Given I think we all kind of embody and embrace recovery in different ways in the work that we do.
For those of you saying maybe, but there's more to do, please add it into the chat. Let's talk about what we think is maybe not captured here. Part of what I like about this image myself is that we're actually looking at everything as equal parts. There are lots of things that are important in recovery, but part of it is recognizing that everything is important, and it's not just, we can't overdo one thing. Everything needs to work together in order to really do it properly. So Lois is asking if there's a link to the video series out of Vancouver.
There is. If you go on the Rain City website itself or on YouTube and Google it, you'll find it. But maybe I could send the actual link out to Matthew in the group afterwards. And I think spirituality is a really important piece that it probably is embedded in some other concepts, but may warrant being pulled out as a separate standalone concept.
Awesome. Okay with that? Perfect. So I think if it's okay with everybody, we'll move on to our next section of the presentation for today. And I like what everybody's saying, that maybe we could dig deeper into some of these concepts, that the nuance isn't there. We're seeing sexuality and gender as well. So I think what we're hearing is there's just a lot that we need to consider, and how we capture this in a visual has got to be really comprehensive. It's Bonita again. I'll start the webcam. And we're going to move into actually talking about the guidelines document. It's going to be my job to walk you through the why, the how, and the what of the guidelines. So for the Commission, the guidelines are Canada's first comprehensive reference document for understanding recovery and promoting consistent application of recovery principles. What was important for us is that we work together to create a consistent lexicon, a shared language, so that when we are talking about recovery, as Amy said, it's not just trendy, that people are really talking the same language and we have the same understanding of what we're trying to accomplish. Part of the goal is to seek to build common understanding, shared language, and knowledge of recovery policies, programs, and practices. And it was also to provide a tool to help transform practice, culture, and service delivery. So we do see the guidelines as a tool for practitioners, policymakers, and system planners. We also see it, we hope, as a tool for people living with mental health problems and illnesses to be able to go through and see, what should they expect from service providers? What should they expect when they are accessing services? And I think some of the concepts in here, we hope will empower them to be able to go in and ask for what they need. And we realize that there'll need to be some knowledge translation around that, helping boil down some of the concepts and help get it out to folks. But I think that's one of our goals. So they were designed to apply across the full spectrum of mental health conditions and are relevant to the full diversity of Canada's population across the lifespan. So myself, I also work on diversity, and one of the things that I really appreciate about a recovery-oriented practice is that it is able to address the diversity in culture, language, spirituality, religiosity, sexual orientation, and gender. And it doesn't have to live within a single boundary. It can be applied to all communities, and that's something that I certainly have a lot of appreciation for. So moving the recovery concept forward, we at the Commission do want to make sure that we acknowledge that recovery is not a new idea, and that we certainly aren't the champions of this idea. Recovery has been championed by people with lived experience for decades now, since late 70s, early 80s, and really it was based on their experience. They wanted to advocate for a system that provided hope, treated people with dignity and respect, and supported everyone in finding their path to better mental health. And that's something that we, I guess, as a concept, as a philosophy, as a movement, there's an opportunity as the Commission to help advance that, but truly acknowledging that this is a paradigm rooted in the experience of people who have gone through the system, and that's truly important. So there are a lot of ideas that underpin recovery, like the self-help movement, empowerment, advocacy, and human rights, that all have long histories outside of mental health, but we do want to acknowledge that this is a movement that has come from within mental health. Key approach taken by pioneers also of the PSR profession. So in the US, there's a lot of people who are really pioneering this work, which we want to acknowledge. And I think our goal as the MHC is to help magnify the many voices, efforts, programs, practices, and policies that are already in place. So building a common understanding, shared language, and knowledge about recovery. So the guidelines are really about accomplishing this task of building a common understanding and language. So really, they provide a conceptual framework to help transform culture and practice. They promote the centrality of supporting people with lived experience and their caregivers to play an active leadership role in their recovery, as well as an active leadership role in the system itself. It's about identifying principles, values, knowledge, skills, and behaviors that underlie recovery. And it was designed to assist in implementing a recovery orientation across the country at all levels, so policy, practice, and programs. So I guess, where did the guidelines come from? How were they developed? So they're actually based on an Australian document that was implemented across the country in all of their health regions. So they had this really great set of guidelines that our former director, Dr. Howard Chodos, got familiar with, and he said, this is a great document. We need something like this in Canada. We also don't need to reinvent the wheel. So let's go to the folks in Australia and see if they would be willing to let us adapt this for the Canadian context. So that was really the start of this entire process. We compiled a team of writers whose experience included lived experience, mental health advocacy, organizational leadership, systems planning, and policy, and they became the core of our pen to paper writing team. The guidelines were developed over the course of about 2 years. The writing team started by doing a lit review. They looked at Canadian and international literature, best practices, and sort of tried to get a sense of where the field was at more broadly. Then they went into a sort of consultation phase where we did a number of consultations. We started with what we called the G22, our group of 22. So we found champions, experts in Canada. We brought them together to talk about this as a concept and how we move forward. Once we had a first initial draft of the document, we went out to communities across the country. We hosted, 3 regional events, one in Vancouver, one in Toronto, and one in Quebec. And we brought people in from all over the country, experts, champions, people with lived experience, to take a look at this document. We also held one national meeting with all of the national mental health organizations and got their input. From there, we compiled that information and we took it to our panel of, 14 experts. So people with expertise in things like diversity, housing, gender and equity, employment, people with lived experience, youth, seniors, and we had them take a crack at letting us know what we had missed to ensure that we were kind of capturing everything. Once all of that was done, we sort of felt that we were prepared and adequately prepared to have adapted it to the Canadian context. We also undertook a separate consultation phase with the national Aboriginal groups, with the ITK, with the National Métis Organization, and
the Assembly of First Nations.
The Assembly of First Nations, thank you. And we worked with them to draft an entire chapter on working with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in Canada, and that was something that was really core to the development of making this document a Canadian document. So using the guidelines. The guidelines are really a basis for reflection about how we align resources and organizational culture to develop a recovery-oriented system and approach to service delivery. So they help to present the concept of recovery clearly in all of its dimensions. They're meant to be adaptable according to circumstances and can help to, we hope and we think, build step-by-step plans, building on people's strengths, advancing changes already underway in the system, setting new goals organizationally and professionally, and developing procedures, benchmarks, and measuring outcomes. So that's what we hope this document can help people to achieve. We'll talk a little bit more about where the PSR competencies and how we see them aligning with this work, because they really take it to that deeper level of practice and support people to look at the measurement and the evaluation of professional practice, which is really key to having a recovery-oriented system. So the 6 dimensions of recovery that were captured in the document. The first was creating a culture and language of hope. The second is that recovery is personal, as Amy mentioned, that recovery occurs in the context of one's life, that it needs to respond to the diverse needs of everyone living in Canada, that it's about working with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis populations, and that it's about transforming services and systems. So within each of these dimensions, you have multiple guidelines looking at the sort of breakdown of, I guess, the nuances that people were talking about that the pie chart was missing. So for the second chapter, which is recovery is personal, the 4 guidelines look at having a person-first and holistic approach, how we affirm autonomy and self-determination, how we focus on strengths and personal responsibility, and how we build on collaborative relationships and reflective practice. The third dimension, so recovery occurs in the context of one's life, is about recognizing the value of family, friends, and community, supporting social inclusion, advocacy, and social determinants, addressing stigma and discrimination, and building community partnerships. So each of those guidelines starts to break down and look at different components of how we achieve those as sort of broader goals. The fourth dimension, about responding to the diverse needs of everyone living in Canada, also has 4 guidelines that look at recovery across the lifespan. They look at how we need to respond to the needs of immigrants, refugees, ethnocultural, and racialized communities, being responsive to gender difference and the needs of LGBT communities and peoples. And so within that chapter, we recognize that there are a lot of diverse communities, and we may not have captured our ability to respond to each one. There is an acknowledgement that people with disabilities are going to require a different approach to practice, and that their needs should be acknowledged. And I think we also recognize that doing recovery in the context of working with youth and seniors can be a little bit different and challenging, and so there's information there on what some of the approaches are. The fifth dimension, working with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, is a single guideline, but it looks at each of those groups and the competencies required to look at each one of those groups independently, as well as looking at how we work with urban versus rural populations. And then finally, the sixth dimension, which is about transforming services and systems, looks at how we define our recovery vision, commitment, and culture, how we acknowledge and value and learn from people with lived experience, families, staff, and communities, and how we promote service partnerships and workforce development. These are all, we know, big challenges, but they're also, as Amy mentioned, really key to delivering services. As a practitioner, it's really hard to operate within a system that isn't supportive. So we recognize that we need to really shift culture and our service system to be able to support you guys as practitioners and ultimately be able to support people who are coming into the system. So the next part of the guidelines, and we'll actually show you an image of what the guidelines, what a picture of the guidelines looks like. But each guideline addresses the core principles, values, knowledge, skills, and behaviors for practitioners. So core principles for us are those aspects that are foundational to the entire set of values. So the knowledge, the skills, the behaviors, the practice, and it's sort of the broader picture of all of that. The values are the beliefs and attitudes held by individuals that shape or influence behavior, noting that values also have an emotive component. Knowledge for us is defined as that which is intellectually understood or can be learned. The tables don't distinguish between levels or types of knowledge, just that this is something that can be learned and grown on. Skills and behaviors for us are that which is manifested in observable actions. So how we actually demonstrate the skills and the competencies that we're learning. In addition to those areas, we've got good practice reflective questions and good leadership reflective questions. And these were intended to support individuals and practitioners in their efforts to translate recovery principles into their daily practice. So we'll look at a couple of those at the end, and hopefully there'll be time for everybody to respond. And then the leadership questions are really directed at service providers, managers, and leaders. And these are they really describe the activities and governance structures that could be expected of a truly recovery-oriented organization. As the final two components that you'll see in the guidelines are the opportunities sections and the resource materials. So the opportunities are really suggestions for types of activities that could assist when we're going into the implementation phase of moving towards a recovery-oriented practice. And the resource materials are additional references that can guide and support implementation. A lot of them were used in the creation of the document itself, but our research team went out and looked for additional resources that we thought were important or key to implementing. So the first chapter of the guidelines are all about creating a language of hope, a culture and languages of hope. So I want to make it clear that hope in this context is not an abstract principle. It's not just sort of an airy-fairy thing. What we're really talking about is holding an expectation for positive development. And so it can be activated by holding a belief in everyone's potential to build a life of meaning and purpose. So when encouraged to focus on strengths instead of weaknesses, people are more likely to access resources, take risks, and explore opportunities. So now I'm going to pass it over to Amy, who's going to help us unpack in a little sort of more detail how we look at all of these different components together.
Thanks, Bonita. I think, earlier on you raised with the pie chart some of the nuance that falls behind recovery and how there's so many concepts embedded within it. And that's, as Bonita was just talking about, that's a bit of what we were hoping to achieve with the guidelines, is to start to unpack some of that. And so I would encourage you to take a look at the guidelines, spend some time flipping through them. There's a lot of content there. And we thought we would drill into the hope chapter as a starting place in the first dimension, because we think that hope is really foundational to recovery. And as Bonita was talking about, that it plays a really important role. And I think that, when we think about it as practitioners, hope has many expressions. And so it's not going to mean the same thing to any one person. For some, it's about returning to a previous life or sort of previous goals. For others, it means something different. I mean, youth have mentioned to us that the concept of recovery doesn't necessarily resonate for them because they're starting out. So it's not necessarily a return to something, but it's about moving forward. And I think sort of regardless of what we call it, those concepts of recovery, that working from a place of hope and support is ones that are going to apply to most people and hold true for most people. And so even as things may be different from person to person, hope is common to all. And I think one of the other pieces that's important to mention is that it's not about, holding out hope isn't about giving false hope, that or ignoring sort of the distress or challenges, the very real realities that many people are living with. But instead, it's about holding it out to people and about seeing it in people even in the midst of crisis. And so as practitioners, it's really important how we communicate and how we model hope, and being aware of the language that we use, being aware of the resources we use, like advanced care directives or using recovery action plans that really put power, control, and choice in the hands of the people we're working with. And I'm just going to pull a quote that comes from the guidelines. So we're going to show you an example of the guidelines on the next slide, but each of the guidelines are set up with a chapter, sort of some content that defines the concept and then moves into the guideline itself. So this is one of the lines from the HOPE chapter, and that's hope stimulates recovery, and acquiring the capabilities to nurture hope is the starting point for building a mental health system geared to fostering recovery. At its core, recovery is fundamentally about hope. And the reason I like that is because it's all of us has a responsibility to work from a place that's about hope and recovery, including from the system and our organizational level. So on this next slide, this is kind of busy and it may be hard to see, but we wanted to give you a snapshot of what each of the guidelines looks like within the document. So this is just one of many, and again is keeping on the concept of hope and is focusing on the dimension of hope, of promoting a culture and language of hope and optimism. and that the culture and language of recovery-oriented practice communicates positive expectations and promotes hope so that people feel valued, important, welcome, and safe. And then I don't know if you can see, but it outlines, you can see the core principles, values and attitudes, knowledge, skills and behaviors, and that all falls out trying to break down this particular dimension of creating a language and culture of hope and optimism.
Any better.
And so this next slide is just pulling out, again, from this first guideline related to hope, it's pulling out some of the key values, principles, and concepts. So, you know, when we start looking at what are the core principles related to hope, it's about hope is supported by using positive language, maintaining a focus on strengths, building resources, helping people sustain relationships. There's 2 other core principles related to everyone delivering mental health services, treatments, and supports can make a significant contribution. Providing the opportunity for people to express their goals and self-direct their care helps build hope. So those are the kinds of core principles that we see under this guideline. And when you look at the kinds of values, it's about making a commitment to embed hope and optimism, that there's an expectation for positive outcomes for people, and that's demonstrated in our language and relationships, that really fundamentally there's a value to respect and value a person's inherent worth. A couple of examples from the kinds of skills and behaviors that were identified in this guideline, that people are invited to recall previous achievements and reflect on their positive experiences. So that's the kind of a skill set that a practitioner would be able to hold out, that there's an ability to reframe setbacks, that you're able to offer non-judgmental listening, communication skills, develop some genuine warmth within the environments. So those are just some of the examples. There's also, we mentioned, there's a section that's around reflective questions. And so those are directed at 2 levels. One is directed at the practitioner level and one is directed at the organizational level. And I really like those just because I find there are quick ways for me to sort of question the work that I'm doing and am I embedding the work that I've been involved with. So just quickly, for example, how do you model hope and provide ongoing discussion is one of the questions that is a good thing that we can check in with ourselves about. So now I'll pause there just in case there's any questions before we shift into comparing the guidelines with the PSR core principles and values.
I want to take a minute. There's been some really awesome chat happening throughout this conversation, and while Amy was talking about hope, I see a couple of comments. The first saying that hope helps to combat fear, and someone else is saying that I think sometimes when you maybe receive a difficult diagnosis or you're really struggling, that hope is the only thing people have left. And so I think those are really great comments to acknowledge at this point. I think there's been some really, really great chatting happening as we've been chatting here. Matt's also adding that an Inspiring Hope Research Institute is there. So there's a link if anybody's looking to check that out. Great. So if we don't see any other questions, I think we'll keep moving on into our sort of crosswalk activity.
So the next couple of slides, what we did is we looked at the 13 core principles that PSR Canada had identified and then mapped them against some of the examples within the guidelines, sort of some of the principles reflected in the 6 dimensions of the guidelines. And I think really what we're trying to see here is the fact that I think there's more in common than not between our work, and that there's a lot of opportunities to build off of one another. So just for example, on this slide, you see the PSR core principles on the left and the guideline core principles on the right. And right off the bat, we see that PSR is looking to convey hope and respect, that they want to build on strengths and capacities of individuals, and that language is almost mirror reflected in the guidelines around conveying a culture of hope and personal empowerment, building on focusing on strengths and abilities. So really a core commitment to those kinds of approaches. This next slide that does a comparison also is getting at some of the core principles around the rights of individuals to define who are their circles of support, and recognizing that all of us will have different circles of support. So it's about facilitating partnerships using the PSR language in the guidelines, we talk about it as circles of support, but it's the same notion of individuals being able to identify who they want included, who are a part of their path towards recovery. And then the last two really are getting at the heart of which Bonita's talked a bit about the diversity in the culture and the importance of ensuring that there's a respect for culture, diversity, and language. And then the last example that we pulled out is sort of almost more at that organizational service level. And in PSR, we see the commitment to program evaluation and quality improvement, and taking the step of actually involving people who are receiving the services and supports in that process. And in the guidelines, those kinds of principles are also embedded, and that it's about ongoing learning and skills development. I'm going to quickly pull out two competencies from the guidelines that I think that the concepts certainly map within the PSR core principles, but as Bonita mentioned, these were two chapters that we actually dealt with as separate standalone chapters in the guidelines, so that there was an ability to get into a bit more depth and detail in those. So the first was around working with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and as Bonita mentioned, we had the opportunity to work with a number of national organizations to help us develop this chapter. And it's really about building on the principle from the previous slide about the respect for culture and diversity, but it takes it a bit further to specifically respect and reflect on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis diversity, strengths, their experience with colonization, stigma, and discrimination, and thinking through how that plays out within recovery-oriented practice. And then the next one we wanted to highlight is related to that chapter 6 about transforming services and systems. And so again, one of the PSR core principles was around embedding people who are using the system within continuous quality improvement. And this is certainly about doing that, but it's about creating those environments and organizations and systems that really are driven by recovery. And so that it's not just about practitioners needing to recognize the recovery orientation, but it's also about how our organizations are organized and how broadly we want to see our systems and services organized. So certainly I think that there's a good fit between what's included in the guidelines and with what's happening at PSR. And I think we've talked a lot on this webinar about how do you get at those nuances, and hopefully both PSR and through the work of the Commission, we're starting to drill a bit into that.
Right, so now we wanted to take a look at the competencies for practice for Canadian recovery-oriented psychosocial rehabilitation practitioners and the guidelines for recovery-oriented practice. So in preparing for this webinar was the first time that I really got to pick up the competencies for practice document, and I have to say I was so impressed with getting to look at the attention to measurement, outcomes, and evaluation for professional practice. We often hear when we're doing consultations or we're meeting with communities, they say, you know, we love recovery, we want to do recovery, but how do we measure recovery? How do we get at this with our staff and our practitioners? And looking at that competencies for practice document, I see so much of the ability to measure the actual outcomes and getting into, you know, what the physical practice looks like. It's there, and I think you guys have done an awesome job of unpacking that sort of as an organization. So if anybody on the line is not familiar with the PSR Canada Competence Framework, I'm assuming many of you are, but if not, we'll sort of just give you a bit of an overview. So really, it's there to provide a structure to assist PSR practitioners to evaluate practice against the relevant PSR competency standards. So it's there to be used to identify practice, development, and learning needs, and to demonstrate continued competence to practice. So it's really, you know, you're working towards, you know, professional development. It's there as, I guess, a measurement tool to be able to see where you're going as a practitioner, how you're developing, which is so great. So the way we understand it is that it's used as a benchmark to measure a practitioner's continued competence to practice. it's a foundation piece in the development or enhancement of education and training, curricula, professional development activities, recruitment practices, performance evaluation, and strategic workforce planning. So there's a ton of stuff that can be done with that document. And what I like is that I think it takes the guidelines document to the next level. It's really digging into what it looks like in practice on the ground. How do we evaluate it? So to us, we see these two documents as there's an ability for them to work together. The guidelines give that broader conceptual overview of recovery and recovery-oriented practice. So as Amy said, each chapter, and I have a copy of the document here, it's not the most exciting looking piece, but each chapter, I guess, has text up front, usually anywhere from about 4 to 8 pages, that really gets into the nuances, the concept, the philosophy of it. And then the guidelines dig into the more tangible skills, knowledge, behaviors, attitudes of it. So they work together. But really, in my view, the guidelines provide that sort of high level, what is recovery? We also think that a lot of organizations are still transitioning, or they're still learning about recovery, and the guidelines help to, I think, provide a bit of a foundation for people in what we're really talking about. It also provides the recommendations for the reorienting of the full mental health system. So that's really happens in that 6th chapter. And so that's providing, us as a national organization, we're trying to provide that high level system lens. And so there are recommendations for how we do that at system levels and at individual organization levels, as well as the individual practice level. The PSR Competencies of Practice, they really dig in at the deeper level of practice and evaluation. They identify the key themes, competencies, and the performance indicators. And I really don't feel that the guidelines get into that kind of that technical language. We don't have the data, we don't have the indicators, and that's something that I think the two documents really do well to complement each other. So I think using the guidelines in PSR practice, for us, the guidelines, PSR practitioners have their core principles and they have the competencies document. And the guidelines are really helping to establish the shared language and meaning. So everybody in that recovery world, whether they're a PSR practitioner or elsewhere, we hope can start to share the same lexicon and get everybody on the same level. We want to use it in tandem with the PSR competencies for things like job descriptions and evaluation. So when we're hiring, are we hiring people based on the right competencies, not just based on their education or, the letters that follow their name, but do they really understand the principles and the values that we're getting at? We also hope that the guidelines can help to develop strategies for organizational and system level change. As Amy said, she as a practitioner really enjoys having the reflective practice questions. And we hope that people can use them, engaging their own teams, engaging themselves as practitioners, but getting together in their teams, in their organizations to engage in reflective practice exercises. It's really great, whether it's a mental exercise and you can help to formalize it by putting those actions or those thoughts down onto paper to then, build your competency frameworks and plans and, map against your competencies framework, I think is really important. So what we want to do now is actually present a couple of, we want to introduce you to a couple of the reflective practice questions. These ones are a little bit more sort of at the system level, but I think as PSR practitioners, a lot of you are doing this in your practice, so we thought we'd get our heads together and look at, how we're doing this in our organizations and in our regions and our systems. And so one of the first questions, something that I liked, and I really put my head to this sort of in our organization. So what are the visible signs of a safe, welcoming, and inclusive environment in your organization? So we'd like to invite folks who are there to chat with us, to let us know, what are some of the things that you've done in your organizations to make it a visibly safe and welcoming environment. I think in our organization, it seems silly, but because we're a bit of we're a policy shop, we have people coming and going from our office, but we're really not interfacing with clients all day long. But some of the things that we've done, I think, are including really nice visuals in our reception area. We've got a big mental health spark. There's bright colors. We've got somebody there who's there to welcome each person as they enter our space. And we're actually, Amy and I are visiting you today from a room in a building that we don't yet work in. Today is the day that our offices are changing locations. So in our new office, there's this really nice setup where each person's going to be welcomed by a person in our reception area, which is actually kind of new to us. It wasn't something that we were doing all the time. So that's something that we're trying to do as an organization. Amy, I'll ask you, was there anything that you think of when you think about our organization as welcoming?
I think that Bonita's right. Like we're in the midst of moving, so our physical environment is going to be changing, and there's going to be a lot of things put in place that'll make it more welcoming. But I also think that we have a health and wellness committee that is working to engage staff so that we have a chance to just connect with each other. So if someone is new on the team, that we have an ability to be welcoming to them, that it's creating a good network amongst staff that then is supportive of the work that we're then going out and doing individually. So that's one of the places that I go when I was thinking of that. And I think the commission as an organization has been growing. So I think sometimes it's done it better than others because it's sort of constantly shifting and changing, which some of you may be able to relate to in your organization. So as sort of our own staff team comes and goes, how do we support one another in the work that we're doing? Just thinking if there's any.
So we can see that a lot of people are typing right now. And so Paige has just added that their office has a client artwork throughout the agency. It's professionally curated and rotated so that the environment is not only welcoming but also inclusive. So simple changes such as using lamplight instead of fluorescence.
I think it sounds like Kathy's getting at, ask these questions of clients and family. And so to ask, if someone walks into your environment, how do they feel? And what would be different? I think particularly there's a bit about the welcoming, but there's also about the safety issue. So, we're working with people that come from very different backgrounds, and sometimes it's quite vulnerable backgrounds. So how do you create places that don't re-traumatize people?
I just caught something from Vicky. Hi, Vicky, saying that sometimes our provincial legislation does limit what we can do around health and safety and wellness. And so I think that's important. We've also got events like Mental Illness Awareness Week, some of the CAMI initiatives that go on. And so I think some organizations are posting posters, images, information about what's going on more broadly, and I think that's great.
And then I didn't see who posted it, but they mentioned that they were doing like LGBT workshops so that within staff that there'd be training and some internal learning around different issues and ideas of culture and diversity. Another one, Doug is talking about how they have receptionists, but one of them is actually staffed by a volunteer who is part of their job experience program. So that actually gets at the core of some peer support. So you're going to walk into Doug's organization and be welcomed by a peer. And Vicky's saying here to that. She agrees with that.
And Regina. So I think it seems like a simple question, what are the visible signs? What are we doing? But as we're seeing from all of the responses, a lot of us are doing different things. I don't think that there's necessarily a right or a wrong answer to how we do visible signs of safe, welcoming, and inclusive environment. I love the idea that we need to be asking our clientele, asking our stakeholders, asking our colleagues, what makes us feel safe and welcoming and inclusive in our environment, and how do we turn that into a visible sign, something that we can all acknowledge when we come into work every day, when we come in to access a service. See, it's so awesome. There's so much chatter happening. So I think the next question that we wanted to ask each of you is, how are staff and team members encouraged to recognize, reflect upon, and celebrate a person's achievements and outcomes. Again, we're not necessarily working directly with, clients, members, service users, people with lived experience on our day in and day out sort of activities, but within our organization at the Commission, when every time that we have one of our all staff meetings, we have the opportunity to submit the name of one of our colleagues, along with a note as to why we think they should be recognized, whether they've gone over and above what their responsibilities are, if they've helped us, if they've, given us a great smile and really, made our day for something. And so we actually have a mechanism to publicly recognize one another in our all staff meetings, which has been really nice. Everybody that gets recognized, their name goes for draw, there's a little prize as well, but it's really nice for us as staff members to be able to recognize and acknowledge our own achievements within the organization. Now, how that happens with service users or our clientele, I think is a little bit different. Amy's worked in organizations, so I'll let her talk a little bit about that.
I think there was a number of ways when I worked on the At Home Chez Soi project, which was working with people who were homeless and had serious mental health issues. And trying to do peer inclusion was really important, and finding ways to celebrate sort of people who are in the program. We call them participants, and their accomplishments. And so a number of the service teams actually had participants come and lead groups so that they would connect as groups and celebrate one another's achievement. That I was in stable housing for 2 months, and that was a big accomplishment. That I've been in stable housing for 6 months, and so they would have little ceremonies that would mark different achievements, and they were jointly defining what that would be and what that would look like. Another example that I think about is when I was on At Home, we had a community of practice for peer support workers, because they were finding their job in some cases a bit isolating, because they were the only peer voice on a service team, and they were struggling to find a way to stand up and say, so here's the work I'm doing and here's why it's important. So they actually came together and developed a discipline summary that allowed them to go back to their service teams and at a team meeting, share that with their service teams, and then have a conversation to say, so here's the skill set I'm bringing, here's how I'm a valuable member of this team. And it created spaces to celebrate the knowledge that they were bringing, to celebrate the skills that they were bringing to their team within each of those service teams. So that was a way that we were able to connect across the program to then influence their experience as part of the service team.
I know last year I attended, earlier this year, I attended a session with the Recovery College in Toronto, and they had a panel of people, one of their psychologists, one of their peer support workers, and one of their members. And their member was talking about how when she completed a program, there was a graduation ceremony, and that was something that she really liked because she had the ability to bring people in who could, share in her achievement with her. And I thought that was really nice. There was a certificate, there was a ceremony, and she was considered to be a graduate. So I thought, that's a really nice way of publicly, showing people's growth and accomplishments.
So we're seeing people are talking about doing like volunteer appreciation, having galas and forums where people could come together. It's interesting. Sharon raised the question about how do you, when you have frequent staff changes, what are the plans that are in place to help people stay in their chosen path so that people don't burn out, because this work can be quite challenging and can also trigger a lot of things for us personally. And so I think that's a really key point of how do we support one another in our own personal recovery journeys. Ideas about just connecting socially, going out for lunch and coffee, and that we're not necessarily just working about connecting across work, that we have a chance to connect with our colleagues as human beings, chat about what movie we just saw or what book we just read. So that's a good discussion going on here. I think sometimes what's hard, particularly when we think about how we take time to recognize and support staff to staff, is just having the time to do that. I think we're often in our day-to-day jobs, we get so caught up in doing what needs to be done in front of us, the next task in front of us, that sometimes it's a gift just to have that time to go for coffee or to go for lunch. And we talked a couple of times about how recovery is also the responsibility of organizations and the responsibility of the mental health system. And I think that for me, sometimes having the time set aside to connect with my colleagues socially is something that's really important.
Sharon, I wanted to go back to your comment about how we support people, and within the guidelines, guideline 6D, which is about workforce development and planning. One of the skills and behaviors that they hope that organizations, truly recovery-oriented organizations will exhibit is to develop plans and infrastructure to support staff development and staff retention. So how do we create healthy, nurturing, supportive workplaces? And I would also say, for those of you not familiar with it, the Mental Health Commission also has a tool called the National Standard for Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace. So if any of you, as practitioners, are looking for ways to improve, some of the resources within your organization, the National Standard is a really great way to, I think, do that. It talks about where the opportunities are for organizations to support the psychological well-being of each of their employees, and how that fits into the the broader health and safety of the organization. So it's a lot, and if you have an HR department, hopefully they would like to get engaged in that.
And you just saved Sharon typing that out. She just said thank you.
Perfect. So I think at this point, there's still a lot of chatter going on, and I really want to encourage that. One thing that we haven't talked about in our slides is, if you don't yet have it, where to get the guidelines for recovery-oriented practice. First, I would say, if you haven't yet, visit the Mental Health Commission of Canada's webpage, and it is, it's not on here, it's www.mentalhealthcommission.ca, and there you can actually, in the top right corner, you can see the different topics where recovery is one of our priorities, and it's a topic there. And within that, you can see the full recovery initiative. So today our focus was about talking to you about the guidelines for recovery-oriented practice, but that's not actually the only work we've undertaken in recovery. The first piece, or the first tool that we released, was actually called the Declaration. It was our recovery declaration, and you can find it there. It gives that really nice overview, that succinct overview of the pillars and some of the recovery principles that informed the full development of the guidelines. There's also an opportunity for people to commit to signing the declaration. You can sign it online. You can sign it within your organizations. And you can actually print certificates that say, I've signed the recovery declaration. I'm committed to learning more about recovery and, working towards, having the conversation, expanding the conversation about what recovery looks like, how we do recovery-oriented practice. So that's there as a tool for practitioners, for organizations, for people to say, hey, let's start a conversation about this more broadly. The other, tool that we developed, and I saw a little bit about it in the chatter, which I thought was really, really awesome, is that we developed an inventory, the first sort of pan-Canadian recovery inventory. And so that is a user-submitted database of recovery-oriented resources, tools, practices, programs. So people from across the country have said, this is a program that I'm accessing. It's recovery-oriented. I really like it. I want to share it with everybody. You can go into the recovery database. You can type in your region, you can type in what kind of program you're looking for, and it'll pull up anything in there that fits your criteria. So that's another tool that the Mental Health Commission has right now, and it can also be accessed on our recovery page.
And Matthew's been posting the links up, so he had the guidelines earlier and then the inventory now. And then Vicky was suggesting, Marianne, Farkas. I'm on an angle, so I can't quite see the name, as someone who explains how recovery and PSR are connected. So how recovery is really for the individual and PSR is about tools for people to use to do recovery-oriented practice, which that's a good distinction about sort of recovery-oriented practice and our various roles in it. I don't know, we've got about 10 minutes left, so I don't know if people have other questions or if they wanted to, if there's anything they had posted earlier that we didn't have a chance to respond to or talk about. I think we've got a bit of time now. I see 3 people are typing, so.
You don't have to do that. No, so just turn. Just turn your speakers on.
Okay.
Share. So I guess this is our opportunity also to thank all of you.
And just while we're waiting for some.
Well, we just
So while we're just waiting
who,
for some more questions or comments to come in. Sorry, Bonita. I think I keep interrupting you. Sorry. I just want to say a couple of things that might generate some discussion as well. But a big thank you to you both for a wonderful presentation. I know we were all looking forward to it with great excitement and anticipation. And certainly I feel this has been a very, very rich discussion. I think we're very proud of the recovery guidelines. And I think PSR practitioners should be equally proud of those recovery-oriented competencies. So please do remember that those competencies were developed in 2013 to be a living, dynamic document. But I think when we consider areas like culture that we just mentioned, I think that we really have moved past a concept of cultural competencies to one of cultural safety. And while maybe some of the concepts may be presented in a bit of a different way, the intentions I think are very similar. So I was really proud and pleased to hear you both acknowledging that today. On behalf of Vicky Hewen and PSR Canada, I do just want to, I'm sure as a community we know that we're hoping to announce the first Canadian registration for PSR practitioners. We hope to announce that at the upcoming conference in Thunder Bay, June 2016. Any of you who might be interested in joining a committee to help us further this work around registration or around education to become a PSR practitioner, a Canadian PSR practitioner, please contact Vicky Hewen and I will ask Matt to just send that address. So that's very exciting work for us that I think really does tie into the work of the Mental Health Commission. So we're both hoping to roll out the registration and then roll out the supporting education that also honors the recovery guidelines and the PSR competencies, recovery-oriented PSR competencies. So stay tuned. I was so thrilled just to hear some of the talk about just not making recovery the notion of recovery a topical idea or a sexy new idea. For sure, it's been around for a long time, and we just want to really. So I really honor you, Amy, for saying that. We really want to make it a concept that can help people and families to have a good life, and that's our business. As I was thinking about your wheel, I really appreciate the ideas that you've come up with, the concepts. I think that for me personally, I want to move past just thinking about a mental health system to thinking about society and how we can engage society to consider their responsibility in the journey. So just moving past the individual. I know that might have been a bit of a cryptic comment, but moving past the individual focus to one that is really inclusive and demanding of our communities for full participation. So I've mentioned the registration, I've mentioned the conference in Thunder Bay. Let's see if we have any more questions. And as we're looking for questions and comments, you'll know that we are taking a break. We wish you a happy, happy holiday in whatever way you choose to celebrate that. Please look for us in January. We've told you about the 6 new sessions on employment. We have some really fine people coming to talk with us. Looking at the chatter on the conversation today, we've really realized that dementia is a big topic, so we'll certainly give that due consideration as well. And Karina just adds preventative and supportive mental health education. So thank you for that. As we think about prevention and we think about determinants of health, so very, very important. Thank you for that contribution. Appreciate that. Anne-Marie talks about the recovery video from Manitoba. So Anne-Marie, maybe you want to tell us a little bit more about that? Oh, that's your previous posting. Thank you. I expect that's the video. Thank you for that. And Bonita and Aimee, I'm not sure if you have some final comments you want to add.
Yeah, I guess one thing I want to make clear, there's at its height we had almost 75 people logged on. My email and Amy's email are on this screen here. I really do encourage any of you who have questions, comments, who are looking for more information about the recovery guidelines or the recovery initiative, or really anything recovery related, please don't ever hesitate to reach out to us by email. It is our job to help connect people with knowledge and information. So really and truly feel free to reach out to us and we'll do our best to get back to people and get people the answers that they're looking for. Given that there was a lot of comments about dementia, I will also mention that I will be working with one of our other policy folks on Wednesday of next week. We are teaming up with the BC Psychogeriatric Association, and we're going to be talking about the seniors guidelines that were released by the Mental Health Commission back in 2011. So if you are interested or you're working with seniors and you want some information about that, you can register for that on the Caregiver Network, and that's with the BC Psychogeriatric Association.
And I'll just say thank you to everyone. I certainly think that a lot of this stuff, it's not an endpoint. We don't put out documents and then assume that the work is done. I think lots is just starting. So please, I echo Bonita's comments. Please feel free to email us. It would be great to keep the conversation going and learning about what you're doing and figuring out how we can connect across all of our work.
Perfect. So thank you all. I'll let Regina or Matt sign us out. And again, I hope to hear more from all of you in the coming weeks, months, years to see how we can work together to advance recovery.
British Columbia, we are very grateful for your time. From a personal perspective, I sincerely appreciate the careful consideration that you've given to our work and how to weave just the recovery guidelines along with those competencies. I appreciate your acknowledgement that the guidelines provide a big picture perspective, and the competencies, the recovery-oriented competencies, really helps us think about how to do it and how to stay current and how to stay ethical in terms of our practice. So really appreciate you both. That was a wonderful gift you gave us today. Thank you.
Okay, everyone, we'll see you in the new year. Thank you, Bonita. Thank you, Amy. Take care.